This week, our first lecture is on a brief history of telehealth services. The purpose of this lecture is really just to introduce you to what telehealth is and to talk a little bit about how it's developed over the last 10 or so years since the concept of providing healthcare via distance technology has really sort of come into the practice realm. So if we look at just a brief introduction to telehealth, you'll see in our first bullet here that telehealth can be broadly defined as healthcare services delivered through computer and information communication technology to some kind of distance place. Video cameras and medical equipment have also been added to enhance the experience in more recent years. Since the development of other information communication technologies, it isn't just video cameras and medical equipment nowadays that can enhance the experience. With technologies developing as quickly as there have been a lot of additional sort of devices and applications that have been used more and more in telehealth. So if you think about smartphones are a great example of how we can really begin to provide telehealth services to people kind of at a distance. Everyone has a smartphone. If we start to integrate smartphone applications into the provision of telehealth services, there's a real chance that those who maybe don't have access to healthcare in other ways would be able to use their phones or video cameras or computers to be able to access resources. In simplest terms, though, telehealth can kind of be explained as two professionals, or one professional and one client, discussing a case over the phone. So of course, like I said, there are more sophisticated technologies available to aid the provision of telehealth. Some of these things including new video conferencing platforms. There have been some really interesting developments in wearable devices, specifically wearable assessment devices, that really allow us to monitor patients almost as if we were in kind of the same room. You know, we're able to track behaviors and track symptomology by using these wearable assessment devices. And that has really approximated our ability to track symptoms in clients or behaviors in clients kind of in person, in that in-person setting. I have here then that telehealth is also currently being used by health providers in a growing number of areas. So telehealth really is kind of the future of service provision. Like I said, it not only allows us to provide resources to clients who otherwise wouldn't be able to physically make it into, say, a doctor's office or a social worker's office, for example, but it's really changing the face of healthcare as we know it. If you look at just kind of a definition of telehealth, tele meaning distance and health meaning to heal, it kind of makes sense then why it would be such maybe a useful resource to be able to heal at a distance. In thinking about kind of the history of telehealth, where it sort of all started, I mentioned that we have been really pushing the idea of telehealth just in the last decade or so, since technologies have become more sophisticated and advanced in allowing us to provide telehealth services. But really, truly, if we think all the way back to when the telephone was invented, Alexander Graham Bell's first call in 1876 to his assistant, believe it or not, as the legend goes, Alexander Graham Bell actually sneezed on this phone call and complained of having a cold while he was talking to his assistant. So some telehealth theorists like to attribute the very first telehealth phone call, the telehealth service provision, to this actual phone call. I don't know if I would technically call his discussion of his cold, Alexander Graham Bell's discussion of his cold to his assistant, as being telehealth, but it certainly does kind of set up this idea that people have been communicating via distance for a very, very long time, and it makes sense to utilize our capabilities in breaching that distance in all areas of our life, including in our healthcare. Kind of moving along to the histories, NASA in the 1900s started to utilize telehealth services really when they were working with astronauts at a distance, even astronauts that have been sent up into space. NASA is able to monitor a lot of their health records for the last 50 or so years since we've been engaging in space exploration. Has been able to kind of monitor how astronauts are doing health-wise from the greatest distance of all. In 2001 was another really kind of early, very visible example of using telehealth services at a global capacity. There was an earthquake in northern India that really made was ravished a community. And because of kind of the isolation of this community, they were unable to get the needed physicians and emergency workers kind of into the area to treat patients. So what was happening was they had a number of first responders who were able to physically be with the patients, but who maybe didn't have the right education or as much education as some of their counterparts who were in larger communities. And through mostly the telephone at that time, but also some video conferencing platforms, physicians in other parts of India were able to treat clients and treat patients who were victims of the earthquake and help the crisis responders kind of care for in the best possible way those people. And then more recently, if we want to look at even just the last year or two, there have been a lot of support from policymakers for increasing the service provision of healthcare using telehealth. The idea being that it's already an overburdened kind of system, and allowing people to have easier, more streamlined access would take care of some of this burden. As we kind of look at an introduction to telehealth and sort of this brief history, I do want to just bring up kind of one point in terms of the type of telehealth services, the kind of main distinguishing factor, which is asynchronous versus synchronous telehealth. So in an asynchronous environment, two individuals, a treating individual or a social worker in our case, and then a client, they would be utilizing the technology at different times. So if you think asynchronous means not together. So an example of a client and a therapist using technology at a different time might be something like messaging or emails. One person's able to kind of utilize the technology to convey their message, but it doesn't require the other person to be using that technology at the same time. Synchronous telehealth is sort of the opposite of that. It does require both individuals to be using the same technology at the same time. The most obvious example for this would be doing sort of a client assessment using a video conferencing technology. Both people would have to be there video conferencing with one another in order to, do certain things. We're going to talk about the types of telehealth. We'll also talk about, sort of the growing need for it, given the burden that's on the healthcare system in later lectures.